With Andy Murray securing the end-of-year #1 status in tennis for 2016, this really completes another cycle of what's called the Big Four in tennis, which is Andy Murray, Novak Djokovic, Rafael Nadal, and Roger Federer. And what's interesting is they've been known as the Big Four for now about 8 years. And they've been the Big Four names, making it deep in Grand Slams, making the finals of Grand Slams, winning Grand Slams. And this draws a really interesting comparison to the four great players of Starcraft Brood War over actually a similar span of time, though obviously Starcraft Brood War died off a bit competitively around 2012, which was the what was instead of the Big Four called the TaekBangLeeSsang. And this referred to Bisu, Stork, Jaedong, and Flash. Again, players who made it to deep in big tournaments, players who made it to most of the finals, players who won most of the titles. The name TaekBangLeeSsang comes from Taek, is part of Bisu's name. Bang is like a nickname that was part of the nickname given to Stork. Jaedong and Flash, their surnames, which in Korean culture goes first, is Lee, and so Lee-sang means like two Lees basically. So that's where the name comes from, and there's a very similar storyline between the two. And now that Andy Murray has kind of ascended to the status of being like a legitimate world #1, now it kind of completes the storyline between the two, and you'll see how many interesting comparison points there are between them. And obviously, StarCraft Brood War was a game comparable to tennis in the sense that there was a lot of individual 1v1 tournaments, and there was a circuit over the year, and they used to have roughly about 6 big titles you could win there, whereas obviously in tennis there are 4. But you'll see how many similarities there are and how we can model them. So the TaekBangLeeSsang were the 4 golden players in StarCraft Brood War from 2007 to 2011, roughly. I mean, the game lasted until 2012, but they weren't winning by that point in time. Now, the Big Four in tennis were the golden players of the last generation of tennis. And they really only got rolling around 2008, because this was when Djokovic won the Australian Open, and this was when Murray made the US Open final. So this is when they'd all made it to finals, and now 3 at that point in time, 3 out of the 4 had won. Now 2007 was the year that the TaekBangLeeSsang got rolling, because this is when a bunch of them were winning titles. I mean, Bisu and Jaedong won titles that year. Stork made the finals. Flash didn't actually make it till the finals until 2008, but he was already a top player as well. So in terms of titles won over these eras, so for the Big Four in tennis, I'm going to count 2008 to now. And for the TaekBangLeeSsang in Brood War, I'm going to count from 2007 till the end of Brood War, so 2012. So the TaekBangLeeSsang won 15 out of 27 of the OSL and MSL titles, so over 55% of them. The Big Four in tennis won 31 out of 36 titles, which is 86% of the titles, which is insane, obviously. The TaekBangLeeSsang played in 26 out of the 54 finals, so that's almost 50%, it's 48%. And the Big Four in tennis played in 59 out of 72 finals, as in final spots we're talking about here, taking 2 of the spots in the finals, which is 81% of the final spots. All members of the TaekBangLeeSsang were at one point ranked #1 in the world because they had the Kesper #1 ranking. First of all, it was Bisu, then it was Stork, then it was Jaedong, then it was Flash. The Big Four in tennis have now all been ranked world #1 at one point in time. First of all, there was Federer. Obviously, he came a couple of years before the rest of them. Then Nadal took it over. Then Djokovic had it until this year. And then Murray's taken it over now. The interesting thing about the relationship between the Big Four is that there has nearly always been, in both instances, a case of being kind of 2 up, 2 down. Now, it was more pronounced in Brood War, where usually it would be 2 that were winning, 2 that were making finals, and 2 that were slumping. But in tennis, it was more like there's just 2 that are winning, and there's 2 that aren't winning at the time. And that's the interesting thing, because if you look at the relationship in Brood War, that's TaekBangLeeSsang, initially it was Bisu and Stork. They were the people making the most finals in 2007. Then it was Stork and Flash, because Stork continued over from when Bisu fell off a bit, and then Flash came up and made a few finals. Then it was Jaedong and Bisu. We're talking about like late 2008 to early 2009 now. Bisu didn't make finals around that period of time, but he made one, but he did have an incredible run in Pro League, which put him back as a world-class player, and he did make it to the semis of an OSL. Then finally, the last real era was Flash and Jaedong, obviously. I mean, they made together. Flash made 6 of the 6 finals in 2010, and Jaedong made 4 of them. They were the 2 last players who were on top. Obviously, Jaedong only winning 1 of those titles, Flash winning 4. Now in tennis, it started out, obviously Federer was ahead of some of them winning. So then it was Federer and Nadal, and they were the big combo. And early on, it was just Nadal winning the French Open. And then later on, he eventually took over from Federer and had the year where he won 3 out of 4 majors. Then it was Nadal and Djokovic. So Nadal's era of being the 3 out of the 4 finals leads right into the era when you had a middle period that was more up in the air. And then 2011, Djokovic actually just outright was beasting everything. He was playing insanely good. Then you had this weird period that was Djokovic and Federer, when Nadal fell off and he had his injuries and Murray was having some sort of issue, even though he did win some titles. So the weird thing there is Murray won the titles, but Federer made lots of finals, Federer made lots of deep finishes, and Djokovic cleaned up most of the titles, even though he had a bunch of finals he lost before. The period of total dominance around 2012, 2013, 2014, etc. And then, well, it was mainly 2013, 2014 was the dominance. And then, which doesn't make sense, obviously 2015. 2014, 2015, we'll say that, going into 2016. And then more recently, obviously, it's been Djokovic and Murray, in as much as they're the ones winning the big titles, they're the ones making the finals again. And the other two, Federer and Nadal, have fallen off. Injuries mainly costing them the chance to compete anymore. Now, what's interesting is, you can also look, when you've got these 4 great players, at how interesting the matchups are and how those evolve. So the TaekBangLeeSsang in Brood War, it was Bisu and Stork early on, and Bisu pretty much used to beat Stork in most of the big instances early on, in like the MSL, etc. But then Stork had some key wins over Bisu that stopped Bisu making some OSL finals. Now, when it came to Stork and Flash, Stork was in the position where he was losing to Flash in a number of these instances, even though he'd started out the relationship winning. Then you had Jaedong and Bisu, very rarely ever met. That was basically non-existent. They never actually played in a final together, amazingly, despite how many finals all these people made and how many titles they all won. Then you had Flash and Jaedong, who played in numerous finals. And that relationship started out with Jaedong winning most of the time. And at the end, obviously, Flash won a whole bunch. I mean, he actually won 3 finals in a row against Jaedong in terms of when they met. And so that relationship ended up very one-sided. And then let's see, which one didn't I do there? Okay, I didn't do Jaedong and Stork, which interestingly enough was mainly Jaedong winning. And Flash and Bisu very rarely happened. And actually, Bisu got overall the better of those, actually. Had a number of key wins there, and that was in general pretty good, although he obviously lost one on Flash's run to his first final. The ever 2008. So in tennis, on the other hand, we started out, and obviously it was Federer and Nadal, because initially Federer was beating Nadal, except at the French Open on clay. In theory, Federer's worst surface, but still a very good surface for him. Then Nadal started to beat him, not only on clay, but then at Wimbledon, then in the Australian Open final. Never played in a US Open final, sadly, but that meant that the matchup went a bit one-sided over that way. And then kind of remained that way, with Nadal winning most of the times, unless it was on carpet indoors. Then you had Nadal and Djokovic, who were a really great matchup, and actually started out with Nadal doing better, but then Djokovic had a period where he looked like he was the counter to Nadal, was beating him a whole bunch, but then Nadal had like the US Open that he came back in 2013 and won, which made it kind of sexy, and then he always had his wins at the French Open until Djokovic finally beat him, but then didn't win the French Open and had to win the French Open next. So that was always a very interesting one because it was very dynamic, but in general was Nadal winning most of the time, and then this middle period of Djokovic. Then obviously you had Djokovic and Murray, which was a very even matchup up until recently. And even though Murray won some of his big titles over Djokovic, in general, Djokovic beat Murray a lot in this latter era when Djokovic was a dominant player. Then you had Federer-Murray, which actually historically has gone the way of Federer a lot. Not as much in the smaller tournaments like the Masters tournaments. Yes, Murray's been able to get some good wins there, some big upsets. But in the bigger tournaments, oftentimes because Murray was the player who was seen as the mentally weak one, whereas Federer was seen as the dominant champion, he was able to get a lot of key wins there. Obviously, the Olympics in 2012 being a key difference point where that didn't happen. Then you had Federer-Djokovic, which was quite interesting in as much as Djokovic started out losing that, but had a very even record. And then the record's still pretty good. But in the big tournaments, the Grand Slams, obviously Djokovic has won nearly all the last ones against Federer. And that's been a key matchup for him there. And then you have Nadal-Murray, which hasn't happened that often, actually. It happened mainly in like the Masters tournaments. And then in Grand Slams, actually, Murray was one of the people early on who got some upset wins over Nadal, which allowed Federer to win some more titles, actually. In fact, famously, obviously, there was the Australian Open. I think it was the 2010 final, right? So very interesting matchups there, but that's one that we haven't seen very often. We haven't seen Nadal-Murray in finals, really. And so that's been like kind of the Flash Bisu one that we didn't see so much. You then have to also consider that you could also model these guys in terms of which ones are which of the TaekBangLeeSsang and the Big Four, depending on different factors. So if you wanted to go on timing, so I'll go with when did they become world number one? Well, it was Federer first, which would mean in the brutal world, it would be Bisu as Federer. Then it was Nadal afterwards, which would actually mean Stork would be Nadal in this sense. Then it was Djokovic, which would mean Jaedong would be Djokovic. And then it was Flash last, which would mean Murray last, and he would be Flash. Now, that obviously doesn't work out very well in terms of style of player or actual number of titles won, but that's just one way you can model it. Another way you can model it would be titles won. So you have to ignore the fact that over that golden period that I counted all the finals for, Federer already had won a whole bunch of his titles, in fact most of them, before that era started. He'd already cleaned up a lot of his titles. So if you're talking about total titles won, and we're trying to talk about all titles of all eras, not just the golden period, then obviously Flash would end up being Federer in this world because he won the most titles. He won 6 titles total. Federer obviously won 17. That would make Jaedong Nadal, because Jaedong won 5 titles and Nadal obviously won 14, which is second best in the list. Then we would have Bisu as Djokovic, because Djokovic has won 12 and Bisu won 3. And then that would make Stork Murray, which seems kind of fitting because Stork only won 1 title, Murray's only won 3. But if you wanted to also, I would say the most interesting way to model them is by the storyline. So in that scenario, I would pick Jaedong to be Federer, because Federer was the first to get to the most titles. He was the one who looked for the longest period until we really got going into this golden era, like he was going to be the dominant player of the era. So the interesting thing is, even though Bisu technically was like the first to get to 2 titles and then was on 3, because after the first couple of years, Jaedong was the guy who very quickly was up to 4 titles, and he was leading the way by quite a lot. I would put Jaedong as Federer in that sense also, because they're very clutch players. They had eras where they were indisputably the best, and they dominated their opponents in a lot of scenarios and looked unbeatable, which would make Bisu Nadal, because Nadal famously was second most in titles for the majority of period of time and still is currently, and was known as a specialist in terms of winning at the French Open, where he won most of his titles. So I think he won 9, right? And Bisu obviously won all of his titles at the MSL, never won an OSL, never made the final of an OSL, and won all of his 3 there. And for a while, when Jaedong was at 4 titles, Bisu was at 3, and that would make it a fitting comparison, I think, in that scenario. Also had a period where he was really amazing and could have maybe been the best ever, but kind of fell short slightly. That would make Flash Djokovic, because Flash came along more towards the end and dominated and got a lot of titles and got right up there in terms of titles. Now, in this particular scenario, obviously Flash got more titles, so it doesn't work in the Djokovic one, who hasn't, well, then again, his career hasn't ended yet. But in as much as you think of the style of play, Flash was known as the grinding style of player, as the boring style of player, but had insane stats, had insane dominance, made all the finals, was able to be in a situation where he seemed like he had amazing offense, but impregnable defense. This fits up with the Flash storyline. And then the easiest one to fit is Stork as Murray, because they were both always in finals, but they were both losing most of their finals. But they were most of the time losing in those finals to the other great players we're talking about in their generation. They were considered the weak player of their generation. By the end, you could look at titles and go, why are they even in this consideration? But there was times when they were very good, and there was times when they could compete with them in a way that the people below us in the list wouldn't have been able to. And he did have his day, just as Murray's having his day now, and Murray's now world number 1. And Stork had his period in 2008, end of 2007, where he was world number 1, and he was making most of the finals. So I think there's some interesting comparison points in terms of it. Obviously, it doesn't model perfectly, but it's quite fascinating that these 2 incredibly difficult but incredibly consistent sports, esports, competitive disciplines had these 4 great players, which had these interconnecting relationships that are kind of interesting. And in that sense, you can kind of contrast them.